That's not going in the video. None of your little blooper shit. Hey guys, goose season coming up here, and this weekend here in Minnesota and South Dakota. Figured I'd teach some of you guys how to tune a goose call. I know a lot of guys who have a goose call and can kind of blow it, but then they don't know how to tune it to where it should sound for them. So like I like my calls to blow a little heavier, where it's harder to break over the reed, whereas I know a lot of guys, they want to make it so that it takes hardly any air to break over the reed. I don't know why, it's total preference. This is how I like to tune my reed. As you can see, I've really messed around with how it's tuned. I drew a black line on where I want the wedge to be up on the reed. And I used to have my call tuned on that black line all the way down here on the insert. So now I've switched it up. But I'm gonna go through like why it sounds a certain way. One thing that's really important on the goose call is where that reed sits in the channel. Right there, it's not touching, but you can see that there's hardly any sort of a gap. If that's further down, it's gonna take a lot more air to pop that reed up and make that cracking noise that you make with a goose call. And that's how I like my goose call to sound. I'm gonna bring it to where it's super easy to break over the reed, and it's gonna sound really weird. So that's what that looked like. Sound like shit. So now I'm going above that black line that I tuned up on the reed, but I'm still keeping it that high. So you can tell, I don't like to blow my call that way. I've found that when I go to a store and I pick up 30 goose calls at like Shields or Cabela's or anything like that, I have a really hard time blowing it the way that people tune their calls. And that has played a huge judgment at my early stages of buying goose calls and stuff like that, because I just thought the call sounded like shit. I encourage every single person that when they buy a goose call or not, or when they're trying one out, take it apart and tune it up to where you can make it sound like a good cluck, a good moan, whatever, and then do your judgment on a call based off of that. Here you've got your reed, obviously, then you got your wedge, and then you got the other half of your guts here. These slide inside of the insert, and the way you put them in really matters. I mean, really, really. Even just the tiniest adjustment can make your goose call sound completely different. You have your wedge further up on the reed, like so. Up here, you're gonna get a smaller goose, like a lesser or a cackler. If you have it further down here, this line is where it's about perfect for honkers. A little bit further, you get a deeper goose, deeper, 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 way harder to break over, way harder for it to make it sound like a really good sounding goose, realistic sounding goose. So I've noticed that a lot of people have troubles, you know, getting the reed right and such. You can see when I push down that there's a nice gap up there. That's too much of a gap. What I like to do is I like to bend that down and then slide it up. I push down on the reed, and I slide it up so it's sitting inside of that tone channel. Then I take my hand like this, so it's staying there. And I take my wedge. I already have a pre-drawn line, so I can have my thumb there like so. Take my insert, slide it up there and twist it in there real nice and slow. Look at how that reed is just absolutely perfect in there. It's not sticking. You're gonna wanna slide it in there just barely. Put it in there, put your insert back on there, or your barrel back on there, and then you're gonna wanna give it a try. You're gonna find that it's either too hard to break over or something like that. There's not enough pressure on your reed. If that's not how it is, how you like it, you can either slide it out a little bit by twisting it, keeping that reed in place, or you can take both fingers and slowly and nicely push down like that. Any tiny adjustment makes a huge difference. As I'm looking over the footage from what we shot last week about how to tune your goose call, I realized that I left out a very key component. As you can see on my goose call, you see how far down the wedge is, how close it is to the opening of the insert. The lower that you bring the wedge and the rest of the tone board down, the more responsive that your call is going to be. So the higher up it is, the less responsive it's going to be. And what that means is, if I push this down even further, it makes that reed so tight against in between the wedge and the tone board that I can blow the call a lot faster and harder, and it'll produce more of a crack on the goose call. Whereas if I twist it out a little bit and just have it barely snug in there, it will be less responsive, I guess you can call it. So once you have your lines marked, you know exactly where the call should be, so just in case you do have to take a call apart in the field, you can easily put it back together. If it sounds a little weird, now you know exactly what to do to get your call back up and running. Thanks for watching, guys.